Hey guys, welcome to the Sua Sponte podcast. I'm Ken Harper, your host, and today again with me is Phil Kramer. He was the battalion chaplain for 3rd Bat from 2008 to 2011 and the regimental chaplain from 2014 to 2017, and he retired at RTB. Sir, we just wanted to discuss today to help Rangers that are struggling with just what they did during their time of service was good and right and proper and not have that feeling of either we did everything for nothing or how do we know what we did was right. And so I just wanted to have a discussion with you about how do you help guys with that moral dilemma?
Well, Ken, thanks so much for having me on again, brother. And man, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak into this. I think this is a real challenge for a lot of our brothers as they transition out of the Army. Because on the one hand, I mean, one of the reasons why guys join the Rangers to begin with is because they want to shoot bad guys and blow stuff up, right? I mean, that's like one of the things that Rangers do best: violence of action. Let's go on the objective. I remember, I mean, heck, I don't know if this was the case years later, but when I first got in a battalion, one of the things that would happen is your ComCam guys would go out with the platoons on missions throughout. And then at the very end, the ComCam guy would put together a little deployment video, where they just have pictures and video of the guys doing stuff on the objective and on the deployment. And usually every deployment video would include at least a couple kill shots, right? That's like not supposed to happen, but it happens anyway. And there's some pictures of dead terrorists shot up and everything, right? I mean, there's something about what Rangers want to do, and that is to go on the objective and kill bad guys, right? And if you kill some bad guys that night, then hey, it was a good night. Okay, so how does a Ranger reconcile that with coming back and ultimately getting out of the military? And now you're kind of in this moral context where, killing is bad, or we're not supposed to kill people. But man, I smoked several dudes myself over on the, I'm not saying I did, but I'm just saying, I'm quoting, any given Ranger. I smoked several dudes overseas, but now I'm kind of like, there's this dissonance in my mind, right? How do we fix our focus and kind of frame it in terms of that moral context? Because yes, there is this idea of just war theory, and the philosophers go on and on about this. Okay. For me, the answer is in the 3 R's. All right. And those 3 R's is Romans and Ronald Reagan. Okay. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Probably one of the most famous passages in the Bible for warfighters is in Romans chapter 13. And it says this: whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of one who is in authority? In other words, if you don't want to be afraid of the dudes who are out there meting out justice on the battlefield, then what do? Well, do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because he does not bear the sword in vain. Okay, now what that passage is talking about is the authorities that God has set up. Now, in Hot Springs, Arkansas, where I live, it could be talking about the police department, right? And really, the police department in any given city is just a small military force. I mean, the New York Police Department is bigger than probably half of the national armies in the entire world, right? So the principle is the same. There are certain people in positions of authority who are meant to enforce justice and to bring the perpetrators to justice, okay? Now, my job as a pastor, my job as a chaplain, is to take the complexities of life and reduce them down to meaningful simplicities, right? So people can easily understand them. And when I was a chaplain with the Rangers, that was definitely part of my job. Take the life complexities and reduce them down to meaningful simplicity. So if I was to apply Romans chapter 13 to Rangers, here's how I explain it in very simple terms. If Rangers are doing what they're supposed to do on the objective, that's going to mean good news for the good people and bad news for the bad people, right? I mean, if Rangers are coming in landing on the X, violence of action, laying down rounds, and all the rest. That should be bad news for the bad people, right? I mean, those are the people you want to kill and capture. Your HVTs, the guys that you're actually after these dudes, okay? But if what we're doing as Rangers on the battlefield ends up being bad news for the good people, well then, yeah, we're not doing what we should do, right? And so it's always important. I mean, that's incumbent as we train leaders, and I would do, ethics classes for RASP 2 officers and senior NCOs or whatever. I mean, we would talk about this kind of stuff, keeping our operations in the context of a moral, with moral purpose. Okay. So I said Romans, and then I said Ronald Reagan. So if any of your listeners have not watched the video of Ronald Reagan on June 6th, 1984, which was 40 years after the D-Day invasions, right? The Rangers scale the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. They land on Omaha Beach and all this. Ronald Reagan was standing at Pointe du Hoc. He was standing immediately in front of the Ranger Memorial. As a matter of fact, you can see, okay, you can see that Dietz print right over my shoulder. That's the one where the Rangers are at Pointe du Hoc, okay? And Ronald Reagan gave probably the best speech of his entire presidency right there at Pointe du Hoc. And on either side of him, there was veterans of the 2nd Ranger Battalion sitting right there. Now think about that. How awesome would that be to have been there? By the way, did you see that 275 just had their battalion change of command this past week?
Yeah.
Guess where they had it? Pointe du Hoc. My buddy, Adam Armstrong, who actually lived right next door to me at Fort Benning when he was at the regimental headquarters, when I was the regimental chaplain, he just relinquished command of the 2nd Ranger Battalion on Pointe du Hoc. How epic does it get, right?
Yeah.
But let's go back to Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan is giving a speech, Pointe du Hoc, and the speech is literally called "The Boys of Pointe du Hoc." Peggy Noonan was his speechwriter, did an awesome job. Douglas Brinkley wrote a book a few years ago called "The Boys of Pointe du Hoc," and he talks about how that speech came to be, and he talks about the mission itself on June 6, 1944. Anyway, so here's Ronald Reagan. He's giving this speech at Pointe du Hoc right in front of the big stone dagger. He's got veterans of the 2nd Ranger Battalion on either side of him. And this just, I mean, I tell you, man, I listen to this speech every June, and it's all I can do to keep from crying. It's that powerful. Let me just give you a couple excerpts. Remember, we're talking in terms of the moral context for the use of deadly force and violence of action, right? Okay. He talks about the mission. He talks about the day. He talks about 225 Rangers jumping off the landing craft to scale the cliffs. Then he says this: behind me is a memorial that symbolizes the Ranger daggers that were thrust into the top of these cliffs. And before me are the men who put them there. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. Isn't that incredible, man? I'm shivering right now thinking about it. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war. All right. Then he starts talking about all the different participants in the battle. And then he kind of sums it up. Listen to this. He says, 40 summers have passed since the battle that you fought here. You were young the day you took those cliffs. Some of you were hardly more than boys, with the deepest joys of life before you. Yet you risked everything here. Why? Why did you do it? What impelled you to put aside the instinct for self-preservation and risk your lives to take these cliffs? What inspired all of the men of the armies that met here? We look at you, and somehow we know the answer. It was faith and belief. It was loyalty and love. The men of Normandy, and this is where he really drills down on what I'm talking about here, okay? The men of Normandy had faith that they were doing was what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead or on the next. It was a deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. You were here to liberate, not to conquer. And so you and those others did not doubt your cause, and you were right not to doubt. The money line right there, Ken, is where he says, you knew that there was a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. And because you knew the difference, you did not doubt your cause. I'll tell you, man, as we say in the church business, that'll preach. Because those guys were not there to conquer. The Nazis were there to conquer. The Nazis were there, the fascists were there, the Axis powers were there to capture land, to take land, to kill innocent people, to murder Jews in the gas ovens, right? The Americans, the British, the Allies, they were there to liberate. And by the way, just as an aside note, the context of that speech was the Cold War. Ronald Reagan was very specifically casting the Americans in light of this moral context. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower, what did he call the liberation of Europe? The Great Crusade. I mean, as much as the word crusade has fallen on hard times now, I mean, they knew that they had the righteous and moral high ground in what they were doing. And so I found when I was a chaplain, and this is true in any unit, I mean, 82nd, Rangers, whatever, I found that one of my jobs was to remind guys that what we were doing did have us on the moral high ground. Right? We were not there just to rape, pillage, and plunder. We were there to liberate people and to break the grip and the chains that were around them that were placed there by evil men. Anyway, that's why I say Romans and Ronald Reagan. Man, that speech is incredible.
Well, and we'll link to that, but I think one of the points you said in there, well, Ronald Reagan said that was really good, was that the boys were there, to do the right, good, moral thing. And I think that's the same thing that the OEF, OIF guys went to Iraq and Afghanistan to do. It was to help liberate people from an oppressive government, regime, whatever you want to call it. That's why we went. But the problem is nowadays is we look at the exception rather than the rule, and we don't know, we judge everything by one weird situation. And we do it with the police, like you were talking about with your Arkansas police. It's like we want to look at the police using their authority in one wrong way and then blanket everything and say it was all wrong. Well, that's the exception. That's not the rule. And so it was a lot easier in World War II because we knew who the enemy was. They had the opposite uniform as us. But you go into OEF, OIF, Vietnam, whatever, and you have the guerrilla fighters, and there's kind of that disconnect. I think some guys struggle with that. But I think talking about, Reagan and the fact that we weren't there to conquer, we were there to liberate. That's one of the big tenets in the just war theory, is that we're not taking land to take land. We're there to liberate and help those who need help.
Yeah, that's right, man. And obviously, yes, when we talk about we're there to liberate, not to conquer, that's like the macro, strategic level. What takes place at the tactical level, your mileage may vary to some degree, right? I mean, yes, there will be situations where you have guys who willfully do something that's unlawful and immoral. My Lai massacre, Abu Ghraib. We could go on and on because the press just puts the spotlight on those, like you say, the exceptions rather than the rule. But I would tell you that even some of the accidental things that take place, right? I mean, rules of engagement. You have a vehicle approaching your checkpoint and it's not stopping, it's not slowing down, and you're waving your flags at them and they're not stopping and not slowing down. Finally, you shoot around into the pavement, X number of meters in front of the vehicle. Oh, but that round ricochets, goes into the car and kills a child. I mean, I'm not trying to say that I got the easy answer for that, right? But at the same time, we can't allow those types of circumstances to divert us from the fact that we were there to do a lot of good, and we did a lot of good, right? And I think you and I were talking about this just offline earlier, but even for me, I had to kind of reconcile some things in my mind when things in Bagram and Afghanistan went completely off the rails. Right. I got an elder in my church who was a door gunner on a Huey helicopter in Vietnam back in the early 70s. And And when Afghanistan fell apart, I took him out to lunch. I said, hey, man, I don't want to talk about church business. I don't want to talk about the church. I don't even want to talk about God per se. I'm just interested to pick your brain on what it feels like to pour yourself out into a particular combat zone, see your friends killed, and then see the United States just walk away from it and let it go to pot. Right.
Yeah.
And so that was, I mean, yeah, we had a heart-to-heart conversation that day, man, about just what that feels like. So yeah, I'm not saying that I'm free and clear and I've got no baggage whatsoever. But I will tell you that I believe I was a part of a righteous cause, and I was glad and grateful that I was able to participate in that, in spite of all of the fog of war and all of the things that took place that are less than honorable.
Yeah. Well, and at the end of the day, I mean, everything is done to serve God's purpose. And so it will all work out for good. It's just, he uses bad people to convict good people sometimes. It's just how it works. And we just have to find peace in that. And you and me were talking about peace earlier and just how people struggle with that peace. You were talking about that Risen movie and how people want to find that.
Yeah,
and
man.
A lot of us hide from that by drinking alcohol or chasing some other drug or work or burying things so we can just try to find peace and ignore things.
Yeah, that you referenced that movie, man. It came out, I can't remember what year it came out, but it was a few years ago. But it was the story of this Roman centurion who was tasked by Pontius Pilate to get to the bottom of these rumors that Jesus had rose from the dead. So in other words, it's like right after, the resurrection and everything. And there's these stories that Jesus has rose from the dead. And he basically tasks this Roman centurion to go and prove that Jesus really is dead. Now, the beginning of the movie shows this Roman centurion in battle, and he's in some other battle somewhere else, man. He's just hooking and jabbing, slashing and stabbing, blood's everywhere, man. I mean, he's just obviously war weary, and he's got this 1,000-yard stare, at that point. And so he starts his search. And bottom line is, he comes across Jesus himself and his disciples, and he ends up hanging out with them. And so this is between the resurrection and the ascension. So, you're talking 40 days or so. But one night they're in this little campsite and we got the campfire over here. All the guys are bedded down back over here. And the centurion gets up in the middle of the night and just sits at the campfire by himself, just staring into the campfire. And again, he's just got this 1,000-yard stare. Jesus, the Jesus character, gets up, walks over and sits down right next to him at the campfire. And then I can't remember if his name was Octavius or whatever it was, but he said, Octavius, what do you seek? And without even breaking eye contact with the campfire, and Jesus is sitting right next to him, he says, peace. And man, I'll tell you, as soon as I saw that, I'm thinking of at least a dozen different Rangers that I've gotten to know really well over the years. I saw each one of those dudes sitting there at that campfire. Jesus is talking to him, and they're like, Sergeant so-and-so, what do you seek? And he doesn't even break contact with that campfire. And he just says, peace, right? Like you said, Ken, guys try to find that peace in all kinds of different ways. They self-medicate, whatever, just in endless, pursuit of womanizing or whatever, whatever it is. And my heart says, and the scripture tells me, and God tells me that what they need is the peace that you can only find in Christ, man. That's my heartbeat. And when I have a chance to connect and reconnect with some of these Rangers, man, that's what I want to tell them.
Yeah, that's where I was. Alcohol, womanizing, running around, going through divorce, just struggling and justifying the whole way everything I did was wrong. Well, at the time I thought it was right. I thought it was an ends to a means to get to my peace of what my ideal for peace was, not realizing that God was going to come just rack that all off the shelf. And to be honest, I have more peace now than ever. And you talked earlier about purpose, direction, and motivation. I feel like walking with Christ and reading his word and knowing what he calls us to, it's given me that peace because I know that it's done, right? It's finished.
Yeah, that's the compass we talked about it. I think in our last episode, that life navigation, as we call it in that book, A More Elite Man. You have that external point of reference, and that's what's going to guide you to God's high ground, man. I would not give up my place on God's high ground for anything. With my wife and my kids, relationship stability, contentment. I used to tell Rangers all the time. I said, man, if you trust Christ and you build your life on what He says, and you marry the right woman, you got a 90% solution on life already, right? And so I wouldn't trade anything for my place on God's high ground, because that's where God wants all of us to be.
Yeah, I pray that I wouldn't trade anything. But again, I know my own sinful heart, my blindness, like you talked about those pastors from before that have fallen because ultimately, somehow they lost focus.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to deceive myself, but at the same time, like, I want guys to know that there's peace in Christ. There's peace in doing what He's called us to. And I think what people did overseas was ultimately for God's glory and for the good of those people. And we might not know what all that means. And I think that's where guys struggle, is they didn't get that instant gratification to know that what I did here today was the good, right, best thing.
Yeah, my word to any of these Rangers is, imagine yourself sitting at a campfire with Jesus Christ. How would that conversation go? Right? Because at the end of the day, it's not about Ken Harper, it's not about Phil Kramer and what we say, but what would Jesus and what is Jesus saying to that Ranger who's struggling with this emotional dissonance or whatever, sitting around that campfire, right?
Yeah.
That's the big question.
Well, and I think there are a lot of Rangers out there like you and myself, that will help guys find that. They just have to reach out. I'm lost. I don't know where I'm at. I don't know how to reconcile this. How do I reconcile this? And like we always say, like, reach out to guys, find a church, find people that can hold you accountable and get you back on track.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got our Ranger buddies for a reason.
Yeah. Did you have anything else that you wanted to cover pertaining to this topic?
I mean, I think we're good, brother. I think we've given some guys out there some things to think about. And obviously, you're available based on your platform. I'm available. My email address is Phil, PHIL, short for Philip, Phil at crossgate.org, CROSSGATE, Crossgate, all one word, .org. And I know you'd love to hear from your listeners and viewers. I would love to hear from them as well, and would love to be an encourager to them.
Well, and you have a podcast, right, for your weekly sermons, and then also additional Bible resources. What is that? Just on Apple Podcasts?
That's at the church website, crossgate.org. There's all kinds of media resources on there. So yeah, they can check those out as well. And again, I think your listeners and viewers would probably get something out of this book. You can get it on Amazon. Although I think the paperback, they don't sell it on Amazon anymore, but you can get the paperback at Westbow Press. Just Google Kramer More Elite Man, and it'll come up at Westbow Press, and they can pick one up there. And I think this book would be very relatable to Rangers everywhere in terms of finding their way to God's high ground.
Well, like we always say, sir, Rangers lead the way.
All the way. God bless you, Ken.
God bless you, Phil. Thank you.
And you, the American Rangers. 40 summers have passed since the battle that you fought here. You were young the day you took these cliffs. Some of you were hardly more than boys with the deepest joys of life before you. Yet you risked everything here. Why? Why did you do it? Well, what impelled you to put aside the instinct for self-preservation and risk your lives to take these cliffs? What inspired all the men of the armies that met here? We look at you and somehow we know the answer. It was faith and belief. It was loyalty and love. The men of Normandy had faith that what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead or on the next. It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. You were here to liberate, not to conquer, and so you and those others did not doubt your cause, and you were right not to doubt. You all knew that some things are worth dying for. One's country is worth dying for, and democracy is worth dying for because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man. All of you loved liberty. All of you were willing to fight tyranny, and you knew the people of your countries were behind you. The Americans who fought here that morning knew word of the invasion was spreading through the darkness back home. They fought or felt in their hearts, though they couldn't know in fact, that in Georgia they were filling the churches at 4 a.m. In Kansas, they were kneeling on their porches and praying. And in Philadelphia, they were ringing the Liberty Bell.